When Breslau finally surrendered in the last days of the war in Europe, it left behind an image that can be deeply misleading. A German fortress surrounded by the Red Army. Streets turned into trenches. Apartment buildings transformed into strongpoints. And defenders still fighting even after Berlin had fallen. Looking backward from that ending, it is easy to imagine that Breslau must have been an enormous fortress prepared for years to withstand exactly this kind of siege. But the reality was almost the opposite. Before the Eastern Front reached Siege, Breslau was still primarily a major German city, not a modern fortress designed to survive months of isolation and urban combat. For much of the war, the city had remained relatively distant from the great land battles consuming Eastern Europe. Factories continued working. Streetcars still moved through the city. Families still lived in apartment blocks that had never been intended to become defensive positions. Church towers, bridges, warehouses, rail yard, and residential neighborhoods formed the landscape of a functioning city rather than a carefully prepared battlefield. That began to change only when the Red Army smashed westward across Poland and approached Germany's pre-war borders. Suddenly, Breslau was no longer simply a city. To the Nazi leadership, it was to become a Festung, a fortress that was expected to hold regardless of the cost. But there was a serious problem. Calling a city a fortress did not actually make it one. Breslau needed fortifications. It needed ammunition. It needed artillery. It needed reserves. It needed a functioning command structure. And most of all, it needed time. Time was exactly what appeared to be running out. As the threat became immediate in early 1945, preparations accelerated under increasingly chaotic conditions. Experienced Wehrmacht soldiers were mixed with Luftwaffe personnel, police formation, training unit, and Volkssturm. Some of the defenders had survived years of combat. Others were older men or recently mobilized civilians whose training and equipment varied enormously. This was not the uniform, battle-hardened fortress garrison that the later legend of Breslau sometimes suggests. The city itself was being adapted just as hurriedly. Ordinary buildings became firing positions. Windows were reinforced. Roads were blocked with rubble, vehicles, and improvised barricade. Open spaces were incorporated into defensive zones. Groups of buildings were turned into connected strongpoints so the defenders could give up one position without necessarily abandoning an entire neighborhood. Breslau was learning how to become a fortress at almost the same moment the war was arriving at its doorstep. And behind those military preparations stood an even darker problem: the civilians. For months, the population had not been evacuated on a scale that matched the danger approaching the city. When evacuation finally became urgent, enormous numbers of people were forced onto winter roads under terrible conditions. Families carried whatever they could. Older people and children struggled through bitter cold. Roads became crowded with refugees while Soviet forces continued advancing from the east. And many civilians were still inside Breslau when the circle around the city began to close. That is why the phrase Festung Breslau can hide as much as it explains. This was not an empty military fortress occupied only by soldiers. It was a living city being forced to transform itself into a battlefield. Apartments became defensive positions. Factories became supply points. Streetcar routes became military corridors. Basements built for ordinary residents became shelters and, in some places, part of the defensive system itself. With every passing day, Breslau became more difficult to attack. But that distinction matters. It became more difficult to attack. It had not started that way. And that gives us the first truly difficult question of the siege. If the Red Army reached Silesia while Breslau was still preparing, if many of the defenses were still unfinished, if the garrison was still a hurried mixture of formations with very different levels of combat experience, then why was the city not taken before it had time to turn its streets into a fortress? The answer does not begin inside Breslau. It begins with decisions being made beyond the city. and one of those decisions gave Breslau the resource every surrounded force needs most: time. The most important thing Breslau needed in early 1945 was not another artillery piece. It was not another battalion. It was not even a stronger defensive wall. It needed time. And during the chaotic opening weeks of the Soviet advance into Silesia, the city was given exactly that. As the Red Army drove westward across Poland, the speed of the offensive left many German positions with almost no opportunity to prepare for a prolonged defense. Lines that had been expected to delay the Soviets for weeks were broken, bypassed, or abandoned in a matter of days. German formations fell back toward the Oder, exhausted, short of fuel, and often uncertain where the next stable defensive position could even be established. In that environment, Breslau did not initially look like a city capable of stopping the Red Army for nearly 3 months. Its defenses were still being strengthened. Its garrison was still being assembled. Civilians were still trying to escape. And German commanders were still learning how to turn a large civilian city into a functioning fortress. This was probably Breslau's most vulnerable period. Yet the Soviets did not immediately concentrate everything available against the city and crush it before those preparations could mature. That was not because Soviet commanders had somehow overlooked Breslau, nor was the city completely unimportant. The reason was larger than Breslau itself. For Marshal Ivan Konov and the First Ukrainian Front, Silesia contained far more than one objective. The Soviet armies were moving across an enormous battlefield where every successful advance created another decision. Bridges had to be seized. Brigades had to be expanded. German formations had to be surrounded, defeated, or pushed away before they could establish another line. The industrial region of Silesia also carried enormous economic importance, and Soviet commanders had to keep the offensive moving rather than allow every defended city to become the center of the campaign. Armored formations were among the most valuable tools available for doing that. A tank formation could be committed toward Breslau and drawn into an urban battle. But once tanks entered narrow street, rubble-filled intersections, and neighborhoods dominated by close-range weapons, much of their greatest advantage, mobility, began to disappear. The same force operating in open country might advance many miles, seize road junction, cut German withdrawal routes, and threaten objectives far beyond a single city. This is where hindsight can make the Soviet decision look much easier than it actually was. Looking back, we might say, if they knew Breslau would hold for nearly 3 months, why not overwhelm it immediately? Perhaps they would have tried. But commanders in January did not know what would happen in May. They did not know that Breslau would eventually remain in German hands after Berlin itself had fallen. And they could not treat every fortified position as the most important objective on the battlefield. Konov faced a familiar operational problem. Should he concentrate strength to destroy each German strongpoint in sequence? Or should he preserve momentum and continue pushing west while leaving selected positions to be contained and reduced later? In a fast-moving offensive, speed could often matter more than taking every city the moment Soviet troops reached it. So formations that might have helped create overwhelming strength around Breslau were required elsewhere. That did not mean the Red Army simply ignored the city. Soviet troops continued closing in. Roads were cut. The space around Breslau steadily narrowed. But the interval between the moment the city was still vulnerable and the moment it became completely surrounded gave the defenders something enormously valuable. Every additional day could produce another barricade, another firing position, another ammunition dump moved closer to the front, another civilian building converted into a strongpoint, another disorganized group of defenders placed under a functioning command, another fallback position prepared behind the first. There was nothing magical about this process. It was accumulation. But in urban warfare, accumulation matters. A few days spent preparing one block can turn a short advance into an exhausting fight. A few more days can produce a second defensive line behind it. And once hundreds of buildings begin serving that purpose together, An ordinary city can start behaving like a fortress even if it was never designed to be one. By the middle of February, the opportunity to take Breslau while it was still badly prepared had largely disappeared. The Soviet ring finally closed. The defenders were now cut off from any secure land route to the rest of Germany. At first glance, that should have solved the problem. A surrounded city. No normal avenue of retreat. No reliable land reinforcement. And a German Reich already collapsing behind it. If Breslau had not fallen before the encirclement, it seemed reasonable to expect that it would fall soon afterward. But this is where the story becomes more complicated. Because surrounding a city was not the same thing as possessing unlimited strength to storm it. And one Soviet assumption was about to become extremely important. They had underestimated how many defenders were actually inside Breslau. That meant the central question was no longer simply whether the Red Army was stronger than Germany. Across the Eastern Front, of course it was. The real question was much narrower. Was the Soviet force actually assigned to capture Breslau strong enough for the battle it was about to fight? The answer to that question would help explain why a city that appeared completely trapped did not collapse nearly as quickly as anyone expected. On the map of the war in early 1945, the balance of power seemed to leave very little room for argument. The Red Army was moving deep into German territory. German armies had been driven back hundreds of miles. The Third Reich was running short of fuel, aircraft, experienced replacements, and almost everything else required to continue a modern war. So when Breslau was completely surrounded, the conclusion seemed obvious. The Soviets were vastly stronger. The city was isolated. Its capture should simply have been a matter of time. At the level of the entire war, that was true. But immediately outside the streets of Breslau, the situation was more complicated. And that distinction matters. The total strength a country possesses across an entire front is not the same as the strength a commander can actually concentrate at one specific point on the map. At Breslau, the gap between those two things became important. The original Soviet planning had allowed for stronger forces to participate in the reduction of the city. But operational priorities changed. Important formations were needed elsewhere. As the campaign continued, much of the direct responsibility for surrounding and capturing Breslau fell to the Soviet Sixth Army. The name sounded formidable, but the divisions inside that army were not the full-strength formations that their symbols on a map might suggest. Many had already been fighting through earlier operations. They had lost soldiers. They had lost officers. They had lost vehicles and equipment. Replacements did not always arrive quickly enough to restore those formations to their theoretical strength. A division was still called a division. But in the field, some Soviet divisions around Breslau may have contained only roughly 5,000 to 6,000 men, far below the authorized strength of a fully manned rifle division. That did not make the Sixth Army weak. It did mean that it was not the enormous hammer many viewers might imagine when they hear that the Red Army had surrounded Breslau. And another problem made the situation more difficult. Soviet intelligence appears to have seriously underestimated the size of the garrison. Before the battle fully developed, Soviet estimates placed the defenders at roughly 18,000 men. The real figure may have been much closer to 50,000, depending on the date and exactly which formations are counted. That number also requires an important qualification. These were not 50,000 elite infantrymen. Some were experienced Wehrmacht soldiers. Others belonged to the Volkssturm, Luftwaffe ground personnel, police formation, training units, and hastily assembled groups whose combat value varied enormously. A man counted as part of the garrison was not automatically a veteran front-line soldier. But even with that qualification, the intelligence error mattered. If a commander plans to attack a city believing it contains roughly 18,000 defenders, and then discovers that the actual defensive manpower is far larger, almost every calculation changes. The number of positions the enemy can occupy changes. The number of reserves available for counterattacks changes. Their ability to replace losses changes, and most importantly, the amount of attacking strength required to achieve a decisive local advantage changes with it. Urban warfare magnified the problem. In open country, an attacking army can often spread its numerical advantage across a broad front. Inside a city, much of that strength is forced into narrow corridors. One street, one bridge, one intersection, one row of building, one courtyard between apartment blocks. Tens of thousands of men might exist in the wider battle, yet at a doorway or stairwell the fight could suddenly become a contest between only a handful of soldiers on each side. That helps explain why Soviet superiority across the Eastern Front did not automatically produce a rapid breakthrough inside Breslau. Tanks could not solve everything either. In streets filled with rubble, armored vehicles were often forced onto a predictable route. One collapsed building could block an entire road. An improvised barricade could slow the column. A small defensive team with an anti-tank weapon could wait at dangerously short range. Infantry still had to move ahead and clear basements, staircasing, windows, courtyard, and upper floors that a tank could never fully control. So the problem facing the Sixth Army was larger than simply defeating a German garrison. It had to dismantle an urban defensive system that was becoming deeper and more organized by the day, while the attacking force itself was smaller than the overall power of the Red Army might lead us to assume. And this also removes a myth from the German side of the story. Breslau did not survive because its defenders had suddenly become an unbeatable army. They still lacked fuel. They still contained formations of uneven quality. They were still surrounded. And if the struggle continued long enough, they faced an opponent with far greater resources available across the wider war. But during the early weeks of the siege, the defenders did not have to defeat the entire Red Army. They only had to make the force actually assigned to capture Breslau pay heavily enough for every advance. That was a much smaller task. And in urban warfare, a smaller task can sometimes be accomplished with surprisingly limited resources. The paradox of Breslau was now beginning to take shape. The Soviets could be overwhelmingly stronger in the war as a whole, without possessing overwhelming strength on every street. And the Germans did not need to be stronger than the Red Army, if they could make every small piece of the city difficult enough to capture. But manpower alone still does not explain why Breslau became such a stubborn battlefield. For that, we have to leave the numbers on the operational map and move down into the streets themselves. Because Breslau was about to demonstrate how quickly an ordinary building could become something far more dangerous. A home could become a bunker. A street could become a defensive line, and an entire city could begin to fight like a fortress. From an operational map, Breslau looked like a city that had been surrounded. But to the Soviet soldiers who actually had to enter it, Breslau was no longer a single point on a map. It was thousands of rooms, hundreds of basements, dark stairwells, enclosed courtyard, intersections buried under broken brick. And almost any one of those places could become a battle of its own. This was where the defenders' advantage began to change the nature of the siege. Breslau did not need one enormous wall around the entire city. The city itself became the wall. Brick and stone buildings could provide substantial protection from fragments and small arms fire. Basements offered shelter from artillery and bombing. Thick walls concealed movement. Upper floors gave defenders positions overlooking the streets below. Rear courtyards allowed soldiers to move between positions without always exposing themselves on a road covered by enemy fire. An ordinary civilian building could therefore become something an attacking infantry unit might need considerable time to clear. And capturing one building did not mean capturing the neighbor. A Soviet assault group might break one strongpoint, cross an intersection, and believe the German defense was beginning to open. Then, only a short distance farther on, another row of buildings might already be prepared. Another machine gun. Another anti-tank position. Another group of defenders waiting in a basement, behind a wall, or on an upper floor. The attack had to begin again. That was how very small distances could consume very large amounts of time. In mobile warfare, an armored formation might measure success in miles gained during a day. Inside Breslau, success could sometimes be measured in a street, a building, even a floor of a building. For the infantryman, that created an exhausting kind of battlefield. You could not know whether the next room was empty. You could not know whether the stairway had been mined. You could not know whether a sound above you came from an enemy soldier, a trapped civilian, or simply part of the damaged building beginning to collapse. Artillery might destroy a defensive position, yet the rubble it created could form another obstacle. A demolished wall might open a route forward, but the same collapse could block a tank. A burning building might force defenders from the upper floors. Its basement could still remain usable. That was one of the cruel paradoxes of urban warfare. Destroying a city did not always make it easier to capture. Sometimes destruction simply made the battlefield less predictable. The defenders of Breslau could exploit that by treating their positions not as isolated fortifications, but as layers of an interconnected defensive system. If the forward position became impossible to hold, they did not necessarily have to die in place. They could withdraw to another building, cross a rear courtyard, move through a hole broken into an adjoining wall, drop into a basement, or fall back to another street already prepared for defense. That distinction was important. A rigid defensive line can begin to collapse when the attacker penetrates it at the right place. A network of urban strongpoints behaves differently. The attacker can move forward into a neighborhood without having completely eliminated the positions on the other side. A unit that advances too quickly may suddenly receive fire from behind. A tank can cross an intersection only to discover that the infantry protecting it has been stopped. Soldiers who believe they have captured a block during the afternoon may find themselves fighting over parts of that same block again after dark. Breslau therefore did not have to prevent every Soviet advance. The defenders only had to do something more achievable: make every advance create another problem. Armored vehicles revealed the limits of raw firepower particularly clearly. In open country, a tank could exploit speed, range, armor, and visibility. In a narrow urban street, much of that advantage shrank. Blind spots existed only yards from the vehicle. Tall buildings restricted observation. Rubble forced armor onto predictable routes. If infantry was not close enough to search windows, basements, side passages, and upper floors, a powerful armored vehicle could become a large target trapped inside a stone corridor. That does not mean Soviet tanks were useless in Breslau. Far from it. Tank guns could blast openings into defended buildings. Armored vehicles could provide extremely valuable direct fire. Engineers, artillery, armor, and infantry working together could reduce one strongpoint after another. But the important phrase is working together, and coordination becomes much harder inside a shattered city than it appears on an operational map. Communications break down. Units lose contact. Smoke hides target. An advance on one street moves farther than the advance on the next, creating an exposed flank. A local success can produce a new vulnerability only minutes later. That is why Breslau cannot be explained simply by saying that German troops fought stubbornly. Stubbornness matters only when the battlefield allows it to matter. Breslau did. Walls allowed relatively small groups to resist larger forces at particular points. Basements helped defenders survive bombardment. Streets channeled attacking troops into predictable approaches. Positions farther back allowed the garrison to exchange ground for time. But bricks and concrete could not fight forever. Every machine gun needed ammunition. Every artillery piece needed shells. The wounded needed medical supply. The men still holding the positions needed food. And after every day of fighting, those stocks could only become more important. The Soviet encirclement had cut Breslau's normal land connections. By the logic of siege warfare, that should have started a countdown. The defenders might turn building after building into a strongpoint. but eventually they should have run out of what was required to hold them. So why did that countdown move more slowly than expected? Because during the early weeks of the siege, Breslau still possessed one opening to the outside world. Not a road, not a corridor across the ground, an airfield. And as long as aircraft could still land inside Breslau, the city was not yet completely cut off from the war beyond the siege. A surrounded city could turn buildings into strongpoints. It could build more barricade. It could shorten its defensive lines and force the enemy to fight for one street at a time. But there was one thing brick and concrete could not produce: ammunition. Every day Breslau continued fighting, the supplies already inside the city became more precious. Every artillery barrage consumed shells that could not easily be replaced. Every machine gun holding back an assault emptied more ammunition boxes. Every wounded soldier required bandages, medicine, food, and medical attention. If the Soviet ring had truly cut Breslau off from everything outside, the final problem for the defenders might not have required a dramatic breakthrough at all. Time would eventually have done the work. But encirclement on the ground did not yet mean complete isolation. On the western side of the city stood the airfield at Gandau. During the early weeks of the siege, that airfield became one of the most important pieces of the entire German defensive system. As long as aircraft could still reach it, Breslau maintained a thin connection to the world beyond the Soviet lines. Transport aircraft could bring in what the city could no longer produce or replace fast enough: ammunition, medical supplies, equipment, additional personnel. And when conditions allowed, aircraft leaving the fortress could carry wounded men and selected evacuees out. This was not a clean, reliable air bridge operating under peaceful conditions. Every flight entered an increasingly dangerous battlefield. Aircraft had to find their way toward a surrounded city. Pilots then had to land on an airfield that was moving closer and closer to Soviet guns. On the ground, crews had to unload the aircraft quickly and move supplies away from the runway before artillery fire, bombing, or another attack made the area even more dangerous. And unloading a crate of ammunition was only the beginning. That ammunition still had to reach the men who needed it. From the aircraft to a storage point. From the storage point to a unit. From the unit to the particular street or building where the fighting was taking place. All of this had to happen inside a city where a road that existed in the morning might be blocked by rubble before nightfall. That is why the airfield mattered for more than the simple weight of supplies delivered. It bought time. A garrison that is completely isolated must eventually begin counting every shell with the knowledge that nothing will replace it. But if another aircraft might arrive tonight, or tomorrow, the calculation changes. A commander can continue using artillery. A unit can remain in position another day. A local counterattack can be attempted without treating every remaining round as ammunition for a final battle. The air bridge therefore had a psychological effect as well as a logistical one. It suggested that Breslau had not yet been completely abandoned. Beyond the Soviet ring, someone was still sending ammunition, orders, equipment, and men into the fortress. The city could still imagine itself as connected to the larger German war. But this point has to be kept in perspective. The Breslau airlift was not a magic solution. The Luftwaffe of the spring of 1945 was nothing like the German Air Force of the earlier war. Germany was short of fuel, short of aircraft, short of experienced crews. Airfields outside the fortress were themselves threatened as the fronts collapsed. Soviet air power was becoming increasingly dangerous, and every aircraft sent toward Breslau was being demanded by an empire that was running out of almost everything in many places at once. So it would be misleading to say that the airlift saved Breslau. It could not save the fortress from the final outcome. What it could do was postpone that outcome. And in a siege, postponement can be enormously important. As long as ammunition continued arriving, the urban strongpoints described earlier could continue functioning. As long as medical supplies arrive, some wounded men could survive and some could eventually return to duty. As long as additional personnel could still be flown in, every casualty did not immediately become an empty position that could never be filled. Gandau therefore became much more than a piece of flat ground on the western edge of Breslau. It was one reason the fortress's clock was running more slowly than expected. But every lifeline in a siege has the same weakness. It only works until the enemy reaches it. The Soviets understood the importance of the airfield. If Gandau were lost, the defenders would face a very different problem. The question would no longer be simply how long they could hold each neighborhood. It would become how long they could continue fighting with whatever remained inside the city. Yet even before the airfield was lost, another problem had to be solved. Supplies could keep an army alive. Ammunition could keep its weapons firing. But ammunition could not decide where the next Soviet breakthrough would come. A city containing thousands of defensive positions could still collapse if every soldier was tied to the front line and no force remained capable of responding when one section suddenly gave way. Breslau needed more than supplies. It needed the ability to move fighting power inside the encirclement. And that brings us to another important part of the defensive system. Breslau's real fortress was not only the line of buildings facing the Soviet, it was also the troops held behind that line, waiting to move toward the place where the danger became greatest. A fortress can look powerful when every available soldier is standing on the front line. Every window has a rifle. Every intersection is guarded. Every building is packed with defenders. But in urban warfare, that can become a deadly mistake. Because if everyone is already fighting at the front, then when one section of the line breaks, there is no one left behind to save it. That was one of the most important problems the commanders of Breslau had to solve. The defenders did not have enough men to turn every street into an unbreakable wall. Nor could they know exactly where the next Soviet attack would fall. It might come through a southern residential district. It might threaten one of the routes leading toward the airfield. It might focus on a bridge. Or it might strike a group of buildings that seemed insignificant on a map but opened a path deeper into the city. If the Germans spread every available soldier evenly around the perimeter, they could create a broad defensive line. But it would also be a thin one. The Soviets would only need to concentrate enough infantry, artillery, engineers, and armored vehicles at one point to tear a hole through it. And without reserves behind that line, a small penetration could become a genuine breakthrough. So some of Breslau's fighting strength had to be held back. Not to remain idle, but to move. This is where the idea of a fortress at Breslau becomes very different from the familiar image of a stone wall. The defense did not exist only where German soldiers were already standing. It also existed in the units that had not yet been committed. When one sector came under serious pressure, those troops could be sent toward it. If Soviet soldiers captured an important building, a counterattack might be organized before they had time to consolidate. If a street was breached, reserves could appear in the next row of building. If one German formation suffered heavy losses, another could be moved forward before the gap became an open corridor into the city. That did not mean German counterattacks always recovered everything that had been lost. They could not. And every counterattack consumed things Breslau could not easily replace. Men, ammunition, weapons, rest. But the purpose was not always to regain an entire neighborhood. Sometimes pushing Soviet troops back from one intersection was enough. Sometimes the objective was simply to hold one building until another line could be prepared behind it. Sometimes a counterattack only had to force the attackers to stop and reorganize. In a battle where every hour mattered, that delay had value. When Hermann Niehoff assumed command of Festung Breslau in March, he inherited a defensive system that had already been under constant pressure for weeks. He could not change the fact that the city was surrounded. He could not create fresh divisions. And he could not guarantee that the Luftwaffe would continue delivering enough supplies forever. What he could attempt to do was use the manpower that remained with greater flexibility. A reserve formation in urban warfare did not have to travel dozens of miles to influence the battle. Sometimes it only had to move several streets. A battalion could be taken from a relatively quiet sector and shifted toward a district where a Soviet penetration threatened to widen. More experienced troops could be concentrated at the most dangerous point instead of being spread evenly throughout the city. That created an effect the attacker could not always see in advance. On a map, Soviet commanders might estimate that they were facing a defensive sector of a certain strength. Then their attack would begin to succeed. And suddenly the resistance became stronger. Another unit appeared. German fire increased. A counterattack emerged from the next block. It was not because Breslau had somehow created new soldiers. The same limited manpower was simply being moved toward the place where it mattered most. That is why a reserve could sometimes be more valuable than another trench. A trench can defend only the ground where it has been dug. A reserve can defend the place where the battle is about to become dangerous. And Breslau's urban landscape helped make that possible. Buildings concealed movement. Rear streets provided routes between sectors. Courtyard, basement, and covered passages allowed troops to move without always exposing themselves to direct Soviet observation. A relatively small group could therefore appear at different points at different times. But this system had a very clear limit. A reserve only works while there are still soldiers available to hold in reserve. Every casualty made that mobile foe smaller. Every additional district that required protection created another difficult choice. And if several crises developed at the same time, no reserve could be everywhere. That was exactly the kind of pressure the Soviets needed to create. They did not necessarily have to shatter the entire German defense with one spectacular blow. They only had to produce enough dangerous situations, in enough places, that Breslau's ability to respond began to fail. For weeks, the defenders maintained that fragile balance. They lost ground and formed another line. A position was destroyed, and another group appeared behind it. A penetration began, and a counterattack slowed it down. Breslau was not standing still. It was shrinking, and the ability to shrink without immediately collapsing was one of the reasons the defense survived far longer than expected. But by early April, Soviet pressure was beginning to focus on something that no mobile reserve could fully replace: Gandau airfield. For weeks, that runway had helped keep ammunition in the guns, medical supplies in the hospital, and a fragile connection between the fortress and the outside world. If it was lost, Breslau could still counterattack. It could still defend building. It could still fall back from one line to another. But from that moment forward, almost everything consumed in the battle would become increasingly difficult to replace. And that would turn the siege into a countdown. In early April, the Red Army finally began closing on a place that could sever Breslau's most important lifeline, and this time, the city's reserves might not be enough to stop them. For weeks, Breslau had survived on a paradox. The city was surrounded on the ground, but it was not yet completely isolated. As long as Gandau airfield remained usable, there was still a route through the Soviet ring. A route through the air. It was never large enough to solve every problem inside the fortress. It could not replace every man who was lost. It could not transform a desperate defense into a realistic chance of victory. But it could help keep the battle going. And in early April of 1945, the Red Army began taking that advantage away. To the Soviet, the airfield was more than another piece of ground. It was a logistical artery. As long as Gandau remained in German hands, weapons inside Breslau could still hope for additional ammunition. Hospitals could still receive some medical supplies. Selected wounded men might still be flown out. And just as importantly, German commanders could continue telling the defenders that Breslau had not been completely abandoned by the world beyond the siege. Capturing the airfield would not silence every German gun overnight, but it would change the mathematics of the battle. From that point forward, every shell fired would become one less shell in a stockpile that was increasingly difficult to replace. Every man lost would become harder to replace. Every additional day of resistance would consume resources that Breslau could no longer restore as it once had. That made the fighting on the western and southwestern approaches particularly impotent. Soviet pressure increased. Infantry moved through damaged districts. Artillery and direct fire were used against strongpoints blocking the advance. Tanks and self-propelled guns supported assault groups where the streets allowed them to operate. Engineers worked through obstacles the Germans had spent weeks preparing. There was no single moment when Breslau's defensive system suddenly disappeared. Instead, it was pushed backward layer by layer. One position was lost. Another line was formed. A German counterattack followed. Then another piece of ground had to be abandoned. This was exactly the kind of crisis Breslau's reserves had been designed to manage. But now the loss of ground carried a different meaning. An apartment block could be abandoned and replaced by another block farther back. One barricade could be lost and another erected behind it. An airfield could not be replaced so easily. When Soviet forces finally seized the Gandau area, the air bridge based on that runway was effectively broken. Breslau did not surrender. And that is what makes this moment so important. By the simple logic of siege warfare, the fall of the airfield should have begun a very rapid ending. The city was already surrounded. Now its principal airfield was gone as well. The right beyond the siege was collapsing. The Luftwaffe's ability to support an isolated fortress was becoming weaker with every passing day. So what exactly were the defenders still hoping for? The answer is that Breslau was not instantly cut off from every possible form of aerial supply. Attempts could still be made to drop supplies from the air. Special flights could still be attempted under increasingly dangerous conditions. But something fundamental had changed. Breslau no longer possessed the functioning air connection it had relied upon during the earlier stages of the siege. The Germans even attempted to create a new landing strip inside the city. To do that, a long corridor had to be cleared. Buildings were demolished. Rubble had to be removed. Civilian and forced labor was used in an increasingly desperate construction effort. Facially, it is one of the strangest images of the entire siege. A city already being destroyed by battle, destroying more of itself, in an attempt to create another path into the sky. But an improvised runway could not simply recreate what Gandau had provided. Even if enough ground could be cleared, the Luftwaffe now faced a much larger problem. Germany was losing the war everywhere. There were fewer aircraft, less fuel, fewer secure bases, and there was no hidden reserve of air power waiting to rescue Breslau. From this point, the character of the defense began to change. During February and March, it was still possible to imagine that holding Breslau might serve some wider military purpose. Perhaps the fortress could consume Soviet time. Perhaps it could tie down Soviet formations. Perhaps it could contribute to the defense of a larger region. By April, however, the distance between those hopes and strategic reality was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. The main war had moved farther west. German forces across Europe were losing their ability to function as a coherent military system. Breslau was still fighting, but the strategic world around Breslau was disappearing. This is where it becomes tempting to reduce everything that followed to fanaticism. Nazi ideology, discipline, fortress orders, and coercion certainly mattered. But even that does not provide the entire answer. The soldier crouching in a ruined apartment building did not necessarily continue fighting for the same reason as a Nazi official inside a command post. One man might fear Soviet captivity. Another might simply obey orders. Another might know that the unit beside him was still holding and believe that abandoning his own position would expose everyone else. Someone else might not fully understand how hopeless the situation beyond the city had already become. Wars do not stop instantly just because their strategic purpose has disappeared. Systems continue operating. Orders continue to move down the chain of command. Ammunition still in storage continues to be issued. Units continue holding assigned positions, and until someone with authority gives the order to surrender, the soldier at the front faces a much simpler problem: survive the next attack. That is why the loss of Gandau did not end the siege. It ended one phase of it. Before the airfield was lost, Breslau fought with a fragile logistical connection to the outside world. Afterward, it increasingly fought with whatever remained inside the fortress. The final clock was now running fast, but it had not yet reached zero. And only a few weeks later, something happened that should have removed almost every remaining reason to continue the battle. Hitler died. Berlin fell. The capital of the Third Reich itself surrendered. And Breslau still did not immediately lay down its weapons. If losing the airfield had not been enough to end the battle, would the fall of Berlin finally be enough? By the end of April 1945, the question in Breslau was no longer whether Germany could win the war. That answer was painfully clear. The real question had become something else. What would finally make the city stop fighting? To the west, the Western Allies were deep inside Germany. To the east, the Red Army had reached Berlin. German forces were breaking apart into increasingly isolated pockets. The Luftwaffe could barely function as the air force that had once dominated much of Europe. Fuel was disappearing. Command networks were collapsing. Armies that had once been expected to defend the Reich were surrendering, being destroyed, or attempting to move west. Then the news reached Breslau. Hitler was dead. For a surrounded fortress city, this could hardly be treated as just another military report. The political system that had ordered Breslau to become a Festung, that had demanded soldiers defend its streets and civilians endure the consequences, had now lost the man at its center. Still, Breslau fought on. Then came news that was even harder to ignore. Berlin had fallen. The capital of the Third Reich, the city toward which the final great Soviet advance had been moving, had surrendered. Strategically, that destroyed almost any remaining basis for believing that Breslau might somehow be rescued. No major German army was marching toward the fortress. No decisive counteroffensive was forming. No corridor was about to be opened. There was no victory in Berlin for Breslau to wait for. And yet, the guns continued firing. This is the point where the word fanaticism is often used as a complete explanation. There is truth in it. Breslau had been placed under an extreme political system. Orders to hold the fortress were not suggestions. They came from a regime that had punished acts it considered cowardice, defeatism, or unauthorized surrender. Gauleiter Karl Hanke was among the figures most closely associated with the determination to continue resistance. For weeks, the Nazi apparatus inside Breslau insisted that the city had to hold. But if we stop there, we still do not fully understand the men who remained at the front. An exhausted soldier crouching in a basement did not necessarily keep fighting because he still believed in Hitler. Some feared what might happen in Soviet captivity. Some had heard stories of revenge and violence as the Red Army entered German territory. Some may have believed that surrendering alone was more dangerous than remaining with their unit. Others simply continued doing what military discipline had trained them to do for years. Wait for orders. Hold the position. Do not abandon the men beside you. That is easy to overlook when we view the battle from 8 decades later. We know the war was almost over. The man inside Breslau did not know exactly how it would end for him. He might know that Berlin had fallen, but that did not automatically tell him whether his unit would surrender today, tomorrow, or be ordered to fight for another week. A war can already be lost at the national level, and still continue at the level of a single street. By the beginning of May, however, the gap between reality outside Breslau and the orders still being enforced inside the fortress had become almost impossible to sustain. Civilians had endured weeks of artillery fire, bombing, shortages, and destruction. Hospitals struggled with wounded men under increasingly difficult conditions. Neighborhoods that had once housed thousands of ordinary families had been reduced to rubble. and the purpose of that continued sacrifice was becoming harder to define. During the opening days of May, pressure to end the battle began emerging more clearly from inside the city itself. Catholic and Protestant clergy were among those who approached the military leadership and argued that continued resistance would produce more death and destruction without changing the outcome. That represented an important shift. The question was no longer whether German troops could defend another street. They probably could. The question was, for what? Hermann Niehoff now faced a decision that many German commanders confronted during the final weeks of the war. Continue obeying the spirit of orders issued under a political system that demanded resistance at almost any cost, or acknowledge that the strategic circumstances behind those orders no longer existed. And then the final days produced one more bitter contradiction. Karl Hanke, so closely associated with the hardline defense of Breslau, left the city shortly before its surrender. For the men and civilians who remained, one of the figures connected most strongly with the demand to hold out was departing the very fortress others had been told to defend. Breslau still possessed weapons. It still had soldiers. It still controlled defensive positions the Soviets had not taken. In the narrowest military sense, the fortress could continue inflicting casualties. But the ability to continue fighting is not the same thing as having a reason to continue fighting. That distinction defined the final days. Berlin had fallen. Hitler was dead. Breslau's principal air bridge had been broken. No relief army was coming. And the war in Europe was now measured in days. So the question we began with is finally close to an answer. Breslau did not survive for so long because of one single factor. Not simply fortifications, not simply fanaticism, not simply the airlift, not simply the reserve system. Together, those things help explain how Breslau continued to fight. But they still do not explain the strangest part of the story. How could the Red Army move all the way to Berlin, capture the German capital, while Breslau remained behind it, still unconquered? To answer that, we have to look at Breslau in a completely different way. Not as a fortress the Soviets were incapable of taking, but as a fortress they increasingly did not need to take immediately. And that is the final piece of the Breslau paradox. By the opening days of May 1945, Breslau still had not been captured by the Red Army. Taken alone, that fact can make the German defense look like an astonishing success. Nearly 3 months under siege. The principal airfield loss. Large parts of the city reduced to rubble. Berlin fallen. Hitler dead. And still no white flag. But to understand what Breslau had actually achieved, we have to ask a different question. Did the Red Army still need Breslau to fall immediately? This is where the final pieces of the paradox come together. When Soviet forces first approached Siege, Breslau clearly mattered. It was a major transportation center, an important city on the Oder, a place from which German troops could influence roads, railways, and Soviet movement through the region. If the city could be taken quickly, that would obviously be useful. But when Breslau refused to fall quickly, the Red Army did not have to stop the entire offensive to destroy it. That is the difference between a fortress that is dangerous and a fortress that is decisive. Breslau remained dangerous. German soldiers inside it could still fight. They could still inflict casualties. The Soviets still had to maintain forces around the encirclement to keep the garrison contained. But Breslau could no longer stop the Red Army as a whole. Other Soviet armies continued moving west. Larger operations continued. More important objectives appeared. And eventually, Berlin itself became the center of the final campaign. That is why the idea that Breslau somehow held the Red Army away from Berlin can be misleading. Soviet troops were tied down around the fortress. That was real. But Breslau did not freeze the full weight of Soviet power in place. It did not prevent the advance into central Germany. And it did not save Berlin. In a strange way, The effectiveness of Breslau's defense helped make the city less important. Once the Germans demonstrated that taking every block would require time and casualties, Soviet commanders had a choice. They could pour still more strength into an expensive urban battle, or keep Breslau isolated, maintain enough pressure to contain it, and use greater resources where they could produce more important strategic results. That was not the same as failure. It was prioritization. And that choice explains something that otherwise seems almost impossible. Breslau could continue surviving partly because its survival could no longer change the direction of the war. A fortress forces an enemy to destroy it immediately only when it blocks a route the enemy absolutely must use. By the final weeks, the Soviet war machine could move forward without waiting for Breslau to disappear. The war passed around the fortress. The battle inside it continued. And that was the tragedy. Because every additional day Breslau survived did not bring the defenders closer to victory. No relief army was coming closer. No political situation was improving. No new German front was forming that could transform the defense into part of a successful counteroffensive. Only the cost continued to grow. Another building destroyed. Another soldier wounded. Another civilian forced into a cellar. Another part of the city converted into battlefield for a purpose that was becoming harder to explain. So when Hermann Niehoff finally agreed to surrender on the 6th of May, it was not because every German defensive position in Breslau had been physically overrun. They had not all been taken. Nor had every weapon fallen silent for lack of ammunition. The fortress still possessed the physical ability to continue resisting. What had finally disappeared was any meaningful relationship between that ability and the outcome of the war. That gives us the answer to the question that has followed this story from the beginning. Berlin fell while Breslau continued fighting because a series of conditions made continued resistance possible. The Soviets had not initially concentrated everything against the city. The size of the garrison had been underestimated. Urban terrain slowed assault. Layered strongpoints and mobile reserves allowed the Germans to contain local breakthroughs. Gandau airfield prolonged the flow of supplies. Discipline, coercion, fear of captivity, and the inertia of a functioning military system kept men at their positions even after realistic strategic hope was disappearing. But the final piece is what makes Breslau so unusual. The Red Army did not need to capture Breslau in order to capture Berlin. Once that became true, time meant something very different to each side. For the defenders, every additional day could be described as another day the fortress had not fallen. For the Soviets, every additional day did not have to become another all-out assault. They could maintain the encirclement and allow the collapse of Germany itself to do part of the work. That is the final paradox of Festung Breslau. The defense succeeded in delaying its own defeat. But it was no longer important enough to delay the defeat of the Third Reich. When German soldiers finally emerged from the ruins and laid down their weapons, Breslau had accomplished something few would have predicted when the siege began. It had held out longer than Berlin. But that was not victory. It was survival inside a war that had already moved beyond it. Breslau had avoided falling quickly, but by the end, the fact that it was still standing could no longer change anything.